step into the shadows of a forgotten American tragedy, where love twisted into betrayal, and secrets were buried deeper than the graves they left behind. Today, we unravel a chilling tale from 1890s Georgia, a story of forbidden desire, cold-blooded deception, and a murder so cunning it stayed hidden for over a century. Buckle up, because this dark chapter from the past will grip you until the very end. Let's dive in. On October 12, 1890, the town of Savannah, Georgia, witnessed something that would haunt its residents for generations. A wedding ceremony between 47-year-old Henry Caldwell and 24-year-old Lily O'Connor took place just 4 months after the mysterious hunting accident that claimed the life of Thomas Caldwell, Henry's own son, and Lily's original fiancée. What seemed like a grieving father offering protection to his deceased son's bride was actually the culmination of the most calculated and sinister love affair in Chatham County's history. The couple's passionate conspiracy involved 3 failed murder attempts, systematic poisoning, and ultimately a cold-blooded execution disguised as a hunting mishap. Local records carefully hidden in the Chatham County courthouse basement for over a century reveal a trail of evidence that authorities deliberately ignored, and witnesses who mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances whenever they spoke too freely about what they had seen. The truth about what really happened in those Georgia lumber camps had been buried along with Thomas Caldwell, but the evidence was always there for those brave enough to look. Chatham County in 1890 stood as one of Georgia's most prosperous regions, built on the wealth flowing from its vast timber industry and the bustling river trade along the Savannah River. Savannah, the county seat, had grown from a coastal trading post into a thriving commercial center where lumber barons, cattle ranchers, and river merchants competed for dominance in the rapidly expanding post-Civil War economy. Henry Caldwell had arrived in Chatham County 17 years earlier, an ambitious young man from Virginia with enough capital to purchase a failing sawmill and the vision to transform it into the largest lumber operation between Charleston and Jacksonville. By 1890, Caldwell Lumber Company employed over 250 men and controlled thousands of acres of prime timberland in the coastal plain. The sound of Henry's steam-powered saws echoed through the Savannah River Valley from dawn to dusk, and his lumber supplied construction projects as far away as Atlanta and Mobile. At 47, Henry cut an imposing figure in Savannah society. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with iron-gray hair and sharp green eyes, he commanded respect through a combination of business acumen and carefully cultivated charm. His late wife, Elizabeth, had died of pneumonia 4 years earlier, leaving him to raise their only son, Thomas, then 25, and already showing signs of the frail health that had plagued the Caldwell men for generations. Thomas Caldwell represented everything his father both loved and despised about his own bloodline. The young man possessed his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle nature, but lacked the ruthless drive that had built the family fortune. Where Henry saw opportunity, Thomas saw obligation. Where his father demanded results, Thomas preferred compromise. At 28, Thomas managed the lumber company's bookkeeping and customer relations, tasks that kept him safely away from the dangerous machinery and demanding physical labor that his father believed built character. The lumber camps themselves sprawled across the heavily forested flats east of Savannah, connected to the main mill by a network of narrow-gauge railroad tracks that carried massive logs down to the Savannah River. These camps housed a rough collection of loggers, many of them Scottish and Italian immigrants who had fled the industrial cities of the Northeast, seeking work in America's expanding frontier. They lived in crude bunkhouses, worked 6 days a week in conditions that claimed several lives each year, and spent their Saturday nights drinking and gambling in the taverns of Savannah's notorious River District. It was into this masculine world of sawdust, sweat, and sudden death that Lily O'Connor arrived on a crisp October morning in 1890, stepping off the paddle-wheeler Carolina Star with nothing but a worn satchel and a letter of introduction from Thomas Caldwell. Lily had been born in County Galway, Ireland, but her family had immigrated to Philadelphia when she was 8 years old. Her father, Sean O'Connor, worked as a dock laborer until tuberculosis claimed him when Lily was 16. Her mother, Mary, took in washing and sewing to support Lily and her 2 younger brothers, but the family struggled constantly against poverty and the anti-Irish prejudice that pervaded Philadelphia's employment practices. When a marriage broker approached Mary O'Connor in the summer of 1890, With news that a prosperous Georgia businessman sought a suitable Irish wife for his son, the family saw it as divine providence. Thomas Caldwell had placed his requirements through a series of Catholic parish networks, a young woman of good character, devout faith, and practical skills who would be willing to travel south for marriage to a successful lumber heir. Lily possessed all these qualities, but she also carried something that had not been requested: a fierce intelligence and an ambitious spirit that chafed against the limited opportunities available to Irish immigrant women in 1890s America. At 24, she had already worked as a seamstress, a shopgirl, and a tutor for wealthy Protestant families who paid her less than they paid their stable boys. The prospect of marrying a lumber company heir represented not just escape from poverty, but entry into a social class that had always been denied to people of her background. Her journey to Georgia took 4 weeks, traveling by train to New York, then by riverboat down the Atlantic coast to the Savannah River. Thomas had sent money for first-class accommodations along with detailed letters describing his family, his business, and his hopes for their future together. His correspondence revealed a gentle, thoughtful young man who wrote poetry, collected books, and dreamed of expanding the family business into furniture manufacturing. But when Lily arrived in Savannah and met her intended husband at the Riverside Depot, she felt the first stirring of disappointment that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Thomas Caldwell was exactly as he had described himself in his letters: kind, educated, financially secure, and utterly unremarkable. He greeted her with nervous politeness, helped her into his family's finest carriage, and spent the ride to their home apologizing for the dust, the heat, and the rough appearance of the lumber workers they passed along the road. The Caldwell mansion stood on Abercorn Street, Savannah's most prestigious residential street, a 3-story Victorian home with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and manicured gardens that showcased the family's prosperity. Servants took Lily's belongings to the guest quarters where she would stay until the wedding, scheduled for October 25th, just 7 weeks away. It was at dinner that first evening that Lily met Henry Caldwell, and her carefully planned future began to unravel. The Caldwell family dining room epitomized the refined luxury that timber wealth could purchase in 1890 Georgia. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture imported from Charleston, while oil paintings of pastoral scenes decorated walls covered in rich burgundy wallpaper. The table itself could seat 14 guests comfortably, though on this particular October evening, only 3 place settings had been arranged on the crisp white linen tablecloth. Henry entered the dining room precisely at 6:30, as was his custom, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height. Lily, who had been making polite conversation with Thomas about his book collection, felt her breath catch as she watched Henry move with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed. "Father, may I present Miss Lily O'Connor," Thomas said, rising from his chair with the nervous energy that seemed to characterize all his movements. "Lily, this is my father, Henry Caldwell." Henry took Lily's offered hand in both of his, holding it a moment longer than propriety demanded, while his green eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Miss O'Connor," he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of authority, "Thomas's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home." The compliment was inappropriate. A father should not comment so directly on his son's fiancée's appearance. But Lily found herself drawn to the boldness of it. After years of interacting with men who treated her as either a servant or a charity case, Henry's direct appreciation felt like recognition of her worth as a woman, rather than merely her utility as a wife. Throughout dinner, Lily found herself stealing glances at Henry while Thomas discussed his plans for their honeymoon trip to Charleston. The father commanded the conversation without effort, sharing stories of his business dealings, his opinions on Georgia politics, and his experiences building an empire from nothing. When he spoke about the challenges of managing 250 employees and thousands of acres of timberland, Lily heard the confidence of a man who shaped the world according to his will. Thomas, by contrast, seemed to shrink in his father's presence. He offered tentative opinions that he immediately qualified with phrases like, "Of course I could be wrong," or, "Perhaps father sees it differently." When Henry asked about production figures from the main sawmill, Thomas fumbled through his explanation, clearly nervous about making any statement that might contradict his father's expectations. "You must understand, Miss O'Connor," Henry said as dessert was served, "that Thomas has many fine qualities, but business requires a certain ruthlessness that doesn't come naturally to him. He's too gentle for his own good." The comment was delivered with apparent affection, but Lily detected the steel beneath Henry's words. Here was a man who recognized weakness, even in his own son, and felt no hesitation in exposing it. After dinner, Thomas offered to show Lily the family library, but Henry interrupted. "Perhaps Miss O'Connor would enjoy seeing the timber operations. I'm riding out to Camp 4 tomorrow morning to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman planning to marry into the lumber business should understand where our prosperity originates." Thomas opened his mouth to object. Clearly, he had planned a quiet morning introducing Lily to his poetry collection, but his father's suggestion carried the weight of a command. "Of course," Thomas said weakly, "if Lily would find that interesting." Lily accepted immediately, though she couldn't have explained why. Something about Henry's invitation felt dangerous, and danger had been absent from her carefully circumscribed life for far too long. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first hints of autumn coloring the oak and pine trees that dotted the flats east of Savannah. Lily had dressed in her most practical outfit, a dark green wool dress with minimal bustle that would allow her to ride side saddle without difficulty. When she arrived at the stables behind the Caldwell mansion, she found Henry waiting with 2 horses, a gentle mare for her and a powerful stallion for himself. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "My son sends his regrets," Henry explained as he helped Lily mount her horse. "He received an urgent message from our timber agent in Brunswick, requiring immediate attention. Business, I'm afraid, waits for no one." Lily accepted this explanation, though something in Henry's tone suggested that Thomas's absence might not have been entirely coincidental. As they rode through the early morning mist toward the timber camps, she found herself studying her companion's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. The ride to Camp 4 took nearly 3 hours, following rutted logging roads that wound through increasingly dense forest. Henry proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories about the early days of his lumber operation and pointing out landmarks that marked the expansion of his holdings over the years. He spoke with genuine passion about the work itself, the satisfaction of felling a magnificent pine that had stood for centuries, the challenge of moving massive logs down treacherous coastal slopes, the pride of transforming raw timber into lumber that would build homes and businesses across the expanding American frontier. Camp 4 occupied a clearing on a hillside overlooking the Savannah River Valley, a collection of rough wooden buildings surrounded by enormous piles of freshly cut logs. The new steam donkey, a steam-powered winch system for moving logs, stood at the center of the operation, its boiler already fired up and ready for the day's work. Lily had expected to observe from a safe distance while Henry conducted his business, but he insisted on explaining every aspect of the operation. He showed her how the steam donkey's cable system could drag logs weighing several tons up slopes that would be impossible for horses to navigate. He pointed out the careful positioning of the guidelines that prevented the massive logs from breaking free and crushing the workers below. He even allowed her to operate the steam donkey's controls, guiding her hands as she learned to coordinate the throttle and cable release. "You have good instincts," he told her, as she successfully moved a 2,000-pound log into position. "Most women would be too frightened to try." "I'm not most women," Lily replied, and immediately regretted the boldness of her response. Henry smiled. "No, you certainly are not." They shared lunch at a rough wooden table outside the camp foreman's office, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee while Henry reviewed production reports and discussed the next day's cutting schedule with his crew leaders. Lily noticed how the men responded to Henry with respect, certainly, but also with the weariness of employees who knew their jobs depended on maintaining their boss's approval. It was during the ride back to Savannah that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. "Tell me about your expectations for marriage," Henry said as they paused to rest their horses beside a creek that bubbled through a grove of cypress trees. Lily considered her answer carefully. "I expect to be a good wife, to support my husband's work, and to raise children who will continue the family name." "Those are admirable goals," Henry replied. "But they don't tell me what you hope to gain from marriage beyond security and respectability." The question surprised Lily with its directness. In Philadelphia, no one had ever asked what she hoped to gain from anything. Survival had been goal enough. "I suppose I hope to matter," she said finally. "To be part of something important, something that makes a difference in the world." Henry dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, where he picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "And do you believe marriage to Thomas will provide that opportunity?" Lily felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question was inappropriate, potentially scandalous, but she found herself considering it seriously. "Thomas is a good man," she said. "That's not what I asked." Lily dismounted as well, needing to move, to think, to understand why this conversation felt so dangerous and so necessary. "Thomas is gentle and kind and educated. He will provide well for a family and treat his wife with respect and consideration." Again, not what I asked. Lily turned to face him, noting how his green eyes seemed to see through all her careful diplomatic responses to the truth beneath. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe marriage to Thomas will provide that opportunity. He's content to manage other people's decisions and implement other people's visions. He'll never build anything himself." "And building something matters to you?" "Yes." Henry stepped closer, close enough that Lily could smell the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Then you understand my dilemma. I've spent 27 years building something that will die with me because my son lacks the will to continue what I've started." Lily knew she should step back, should remount her horse, and insist they return to Savannah immediately. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you intend to do about that?" Henry's answer came not in words, but in the way his fingers brushed against hers as he helped her back into the saddle. The touch lasted only a moment, but it carried a promise that made Lily's heart race with equal parts anticipation and terror. They rode the rest of the way to Savannah in silence, but something fundamental had changed between them. When they arrived at the Caldwell mansion, Thomas was waiting anxiously on the front porch, having returned from Brunswick hours earlier. "How was your ride?" he asked, his relief at their safe return evident in every word. "Educational," Lily replied, and caught Henry's slight smile at her choice of words. That night, as Lily lay in her guest room bed, listening to the settling sounds of the unfamiliar house, she understood that she stood at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her life. She could marry Thomas as planned, accept the comfortable but limited future he offered, and spend her years wondering what might have been, or she could pursue the dangerous attraction she felt for Henry, knowing that such a path would require choices that would horrify the woman she had been just 24 hours earlier. When sleep finally came, Lily dreamed of steam donkeys and massive logs, and the feeling of strong hands guiding hers as she learned to control forces powerful enough to reshape the landscape itself. The weeks following Lily's visit to the timber camp established a routine that would have appeared perfectly innocent to any casual observer, but that slowly, systematically drew her deeper into Henry's orbit. Thomas, pleased with his fiancée's apparent interest in the family business, encouraged what he saw as her practical desire to understand their source of prosperity. He had no way of knowing that each business excursion, each private conversation about lumber operations, each moment Lily spent in his father's company was carefully orchestrated to feed a growing obsession that consumed both participants. Henry found reasons to visit the mansion during the day when Thomas was occupied at the main sawmill. He would arrive with business documents that required immediate attention, architectural plans for new facilities that needed review, or urgent messages from timber agents that couldn't wait for evening. These visits always included invitations for Lily to accompany him on brief errands, inspecting potential mill site locations, reviewing timber quality at the riverside lumber yards, or discussing equipment purchases with machinery dealers who had traveled from as far away as Boston to court the Caldwell Lumber Company's business. Lily accepted each invitation with the eager interest of a woman preparing to become part of a business empire. She asked intelligent questions about profit margins and production costs, demonstrated remarkable aptitude for understanding the technical aspects of lumber grading and steam-powered equipment, and showed genuine fascination with the strategic challenges of managing such a complex operation. What neither admitted even to themselves during those early days was that the business discussions provided cover for a more intimate form of education. Henry was teaching Lily to see the world through his eyes, to understand power as something that must be seized rather than granted, to recognize weakness as a luxury that successful people could not afford, and to appreciate the satisfaction that came from bending circumstances to one's will rather than merely accepting what fate provided. "Thomas has never understood," Henry explained as they rode through timber holdings on a crisp October morning, "that in business, as in nature, only the strongest survive. He believes that being fair and reasonable will ensure success, but fairness is a luxury that only winners can afford." Lily found herself nodding at observations that would have appalled her just weeks earlier. "He does seem to assume that other people will act honorably simply because he does." "Exactly. And that assumption will destroy everything I've built unless someone with clearer vision assumes control." The implications of such statements hung in the air between them, never quite spoken aloud, but clearly understood. Henry was not simply sharing business philosophy. He was recruiting a conspirator, testing Lily's willingness to embrace a worldview that placed desire above duty and ambition above morality. Meanwhile, Thomas's own behavior began to change in subtle ways that only heightened the contrast between father and son. Perhaps sensing some shift in the dynamics of his household, perhaps responding unconsciously to the tension that crackled in the air whenever the three of them were together, Thomas became increasingly solicitous of Lily's comfort and increasingly deferential to his father's opinions. He began seeking Henry's approval for decisions that should have been his own, asking permission to take Lily on afternoon walks, requesting advice about wedding plans that he should have discussed privately with his fiancée, and constantly qualifying his own preferences with phrases like, "Of course father might have a better idea," or, "Perhaps we should ask father what he thinks." This deference, intended to demonstrate respect and maintain family harmony, had the opposite effect Lily might have hoped for. Instead of endearing Thomas to her, his constant yielding to paternal authority made him seem weak and indecisive. Where Henry commanded, Thomas requested. Where Henry decided, Thomas deliberated. Where Henry acted, Thomas hesitated. Lily began to understand viscerally what Henry meant about strength and weakness. She could see how Thomas's gentle nature, so appealing in his letters, translated in person to an inability to claim his own space in the world, even in matters that directly concerned his own wedding. He seemed incapable of asserting preferences that might conflict with anyone else's opinions. The turning point came on October 10th, just 15 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony. Thomas had planned a private picnic for himself and Lily at Tybee Landing, a scenic spot along the Savannah River where paddle-wheelers stopped to take on timber from the Caldwell sawmill. He had arranged for the cook to prepare a special lunch, had commissioned the groundskeeper to gather autumn flowers for a bouquet, and had even composed a poem that he intended to read while they watched the sunset over the water. But when afternoon came, Henry announced that urgent business required Thomas's immediate attention at the main sawmill. A machinery breakdown threatened to halt production for several days, unless repairs could be completed before the next morning's shift. As the person responsible for equipment maintenance schedules, Thomas's presence was essential. "Perhaps you could postpone your picnic until tomorrow," Henry suggested with apparent sympathy for his son's disappointment. Thomas looked stricken. He had clearly been building toward this romantic gesture for days, planning every detail with the meticulous care he brought to all his endeavors. "Couldn't the repairs wait until tomorrow morning? The mill supervisor usually handles equipment problems." "The mill supervisor is down with fever," Henry replied. "And the Boston machinery dealer who can supply the replacement parts is leaving tomorrow afternoon. If we don't complete the repairs tonight, we'll lose a week of production." Lily watched this exchange with growing understanding of the power dynamics at play. Henry had not simply requested Thomas's help. He had structured the situation so that refusal would seem irresponsible and selfish. Thomas could choose between his personal desires and his business obligations, but only one choice would meet his father's definition of mature behavior. "Of course," Thomas said after a moment's hesitation. "Business must come first. Lily will understand. But what Lily understood was that Thomas would always choose the path that avoided conflict, even when that meant sacrificing his own happiness and disappointing the woman he claimed to love. "I'm terribly sorry, Lily," Thomas continued, his distress genuine. "We'll have our picnic tomorrow, I promise. The sunset will be just as beautiful." Henry, however, had a different suggestion. "Perhaps Lily would enjoy seeing the mill operations while you're working on the repairs. She's shown such interest in learning about the business, and this would be an excellent opportunity to observe our nighttime procedures." Thomas brightened at this proposal. His father's offer to entertain Lily while he worked seemed like the perfect solution. It demonstrated Henry's kindness while ensuring that Lily wouldn't spend the evening alone and disappointed. "Would you mind terribly, Lily?" Thomas asked. "Father knows the mill operations better than anyone, and you did say you wanted to understand every aspect of the lumber business." Lily agreed with apparent enthusiasm, though her real excitement had nothing to do with learning about sawmill procedures. She was beginning to recognize Henry's manipulations for what they were, not accidental circumstances, but carefully orchestrated opportunities. The machinery breakdown might have been genuine, but Henry's suggestion that Lily accompany him to the mill while Thomas worked was clearly premeditated. As evening approached and Thomas departed for the main sawmill with his tools and repair manuals, Lily found herself alone with Henry for the first time since their ride to the timber camp. The house felt different without Thomas's presence, larger somehow and charged with possibilities that had previously existed only in stolen glances and carefully ambiguous conversations. "Shall we go to the mill?" Henry asked as they stood together in the front hallway. Lily met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether they continued their elaborate pretense of proper behavior or acknowledged the attraction that had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather not," she said quietly. Henry smiled, and in that smile, Lily saw both promise and warning. They had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The mill visit that never happened marked the beginning of what both Lily and Henry would later remember as the most intoxicating and dangerous month of their lives. Instead of touring sawmill operations, they spent that October evening walking through the darkened gardens behind the Caldwell mansion, talking with the intensity of people discovering fundamental truths about themselves and each other. "I've been married," Henry said as they paused beside the fountain at the garden center. "I understand the difference between affection and passion. Thomas offers you one. I could offer you the other." Lily felt her pulse quicken at his directness. "Thomas is your son." "Yes, he is, and that makes what I'm feeling both impossible and inevitable." They stood close enough in the moonlight that Lily could see the silver threading through Henry's dark hair, could observe the way his jaw tightened as he struggled with emotions that clearly surprised him with their intensity. Here was a man who had built an empire through careful planning and calculated decisions, yet he was confessing to desires that defied all logic and propriety. "What are you suggesting?" Lily asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that some hungers are too powerful to ignore, regardless of their inconvenience." Lily turned away, needing space to think clearly. "And Thomas?" "Thomas will survive disappointment. He's survived it before." The callousness of this statement should have horrified Lily, but instead she found herself considering its practical implications. In Philadelphia, she had been nobody, an Irish immigrant girl whose best hope was marriage to a dock worker or factory foreman who might provide basic security in exchange for housekeeping and childbearing services. Thomas offered escape from that destiny, but Henry offered something far more intoxicating, the opportunity to share real power, to help shape a business empire that would outlast both their lives. "I need time to think," she said finally. Henry accepted this with the patience of a man confident in his ultimate victory. "Of course. But don't wait too long. Some opportunities don't present themselves twice." The next morning brought Thomas's effusive apologies for the previous evening's disappointment, along with promises that such business emergencies would never again interfere with their personal time. He had worked until nearly dawn completing the machinery repairs, and his exhaustion made him even more solicitous than usual about Lily's comfort and happiness. "Did Father give you an interesting tour of the mill?" he asked over breakfast, clearly hoping that Henry's attention had compensated for his own absence. "We didn't actually visit the mill," Lily replied carefully. "Your father felt it would be inappropriate for a lady to observe industrial operations after dark." Thomas accepted this explanation without question, his relief evident. He had been struggling with guilt about leaving Lily alone on what was supposed to be their special evening, and learning that she had been properly chaperoned eased his conscience considerably. What Thomas didn't notice was the brief look that passed between Lily and Henry as she delivered this careful version of the truth. It was the first of many small lies they would tell together, the beginning of a conspiracy that would gradually expand to encompass much larger deceptions. Over the following days, Henry found increasingly creative reasons to spend time alone with Lily. A potential property purchase required someone with a feminine perspective to evaluate the condition of the house and outbuildings. A meeting with Charleston lumber buyers needed social support that only a refined lady could provide. Equipment suppliers visiting from Boston expected to be entertained with the kind of cultivated conversation that business dinners demanded. Thomas not only approved of these activities, but actively encouraged them. His father's willingness to include Lily in business matters seemed to demonstrate acceptance of her as a future family member, while Lily's eagerness to participate suggested genuine interest in understanding the source of their prosperity. That his fiancée and his father seemed to enjoy each other's company struck Thomas as evidence of his good fortune rather than cause for concern. But Savannah's more observant residents began to notice patterns that Thomas missed entirely. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, whose Abercorn Street mansion provided an excellent view of the Caldwell property, observed that Henry's business carriages seemed to make unusually frequent visits to his own home during midday hours when Thomas was occupied at the sawmill. She also noted that these visits often lasted several hours longer than any conceivable business matter would require. Similarly, Patrick Doyle, who managed the River District's largest hotel, began receiving unusual requests from Henry for private dining rooms and discreet accommodations for out-of-town business associates who bore striking resemblances to Lily O'Connor. When Doyle mentioned these arrangements to his wife during their own evening conversations, she pointed out that respectable businessmen generally conducted such meetings in their offices rather than hotel rooms. Most telling of all, Father Patrick Kelly, the Irish Catholic priest who was scheduled to perform Lily and Thomas's wedding ceremony, found himself increasingly troubled by his conversations with the bride-to-be. When he met with Lily to discuss the spiritual dimensions of Catholic marriage, he detected an enthusiasm that seemed disconnected from any mention of her intended husband. She spoke passionately about building something lasting and meaningful, about finding purpose beyond mere survival, about the satisfaction of exercising real influence in the world, but never specifically about her love for Thomas or her excitement about their future together. "Marriage is a sacrament," Father Kelly reminded her during one such conversation, "not a business partnership." "Of course," Lily agreed quickly, but her response carried the mechanical quality of someone reciting expected words rather than expressing genuine conviction. These scattered observations might have remained merely gossip, except for the intervention of Catherine Ramsey, Savannah's most notorious busybody and the wife of the town's second-largest lumber dealer. Catherine had built her social position on an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone else's business, and she possessed an instinct for scandal that had exposed 3 different adultery cases and 2 embezzlement schemes over the past 6 years. Catherine's suspicions were first aroused when she observed Henry and Lily entering O'Malley's tavern together on a Wednesday afternoon, when Thomas was known to be conducting business in Brunswick. O'Malley's served the rougher element of Savannah's population, river workers, loggers, and visiting cattle drivers, who preferred strong whiskey to polite conversation. No respectable businessman would take his son's fiancée to such an establishment unless he had compelling reasons for avoiding more conventional meeting places. Intrigued, Catherine began conducting her own informal investigation. She enlisted her Irish housemaid, Bridget Kelly, to engage Lily in conversations about wedding preparations and married life. She convinced her husband to invite Henry to their weekly poker game, hoping that alcohol might loosen his tongue about his relationship with his future daughter-in-law. She even began timing her afternoon walks to coincide with the comings and goings at the Caldwell mansion. What Catherine discovered confirmed her worst suspicions and exceeded her most scandalous expectations. Through careful observation and strategic questioning, She learned that Henry and Lily had been meeting privately for weeks, that their conversations went far beyond appropriate business discussions, and that both seemed to be struggling with emotions that had nothing to do with proper family relationships. More disturbing still, Catherine began to notice changes in Thomas's behavior that suggested he might be suffering from some form of illness. He appeared increasingly tired during social gatherings, complained frequently of headaches and stomach problems, and seemed to have lost the modest self-confidence he had previously displayed in business matters. When Catherine mentioned these observations to her husband, he confirmed that Thomas's performance at work had become erratic and unreliable. "Henry's been covering for him," Edward Ramsey reported after his poker evening with the lumber baron. "Claims the boy's been working too hard and needs rest before the wedding. But the mill supervisors tell a different story. They say Thomas can barely make it through a full day without needing to lie down." Catherine's instincts, sharpened by years of exposing other people's secrets, told her that Thomas's declining health was somehow connected to his father's inappropriate relationship with his fiancée. She couldn't yet prove any wrongdoing, but she could sense the presence of secrets that were eating away at the normal functioning of the Caldwell household. Her opportunity for decisive action came on October 20th, just 5 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony. October 20th, 1890, dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that turned Savannah's unpaved streets into rivers of mud and kept respectable citizens indoors with their fires burning high. It was weather that invited confidences and provided cover for activities that might seem suspicious under clearer skies. Thomas had been scheduled to travel to Augusta that morning to finalize arrangements with a new timber buyer, but he complained of such severe stomach cramping that he could barely stand upright. Dr. William Foster, the family physician, prescribed bed rest and a diet of bland foods, suggesting that the stress of approaching marriage might be affecting Thomas's digestive system. Young men often experience nervous symptoms before their wedding day, Dr. Foster assured Henry, as they spoke privately in the mansion's front parlor. A few days of rest should restore his equilibrium. Henry accepted this diagnosis with apparent concern for his son's welfare, but Lily noticed something in his expression that the doctor missed entirely, a flicker of satisfaction that suggested Thomas's illness might not be entirely unwelcome. With Thomas confined to his bed and the Augusta business trip requiring immediate attention, Henry announced that he would handle the timber negotiations personally. The trip would require 3 days, possibly 4 if the buyers proved difficult, which meant he would be absent for the wedding's final preparations. "Perhaps Lily should accompany me," Henry suggested with careful casualness. "She's expressed such interest in learning about our business operations, and these negotiations could provide valuable education about contract terms and pricing strategies." Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. "An excellent idea. Miss O'Connor's presence would lend a civilizing influence to what can be rather rough business discussions." Lily found herself agreeing to the trip with an enthusiasm that should have aroused suspicion, but that everyone interpreted as eagerness to support the family business. In truth, she recognized the proposal for what it was, an opportunity for her and Henry to spend extended time together, away from the constraints and observations of Savannah society. But Catherine Ramsey, watching from her window as the Caldwell carriage departed for the railroad station, understood exactly what she was witnessing. Here was a father and his son's fiancée, traveling unchaperoned to another city just days before a wedding that had already generated whispers about inappropriate relationships and suspicious behavior. Catherine's response was swift and decisive. She sent her most trusted servant to the telegraph office with urgent messages to 3 of her most reliable correspondents in Augusta, society ladies whose networks of information rivaled her own, and who could be counted upon to observe and report on any unusual activities involving visiting timber merchants and their female companions. More importantly, Catherine decided to pay a social call on the ailing Thomas Caldwell. Armed with a basket of medicinal herbs and her most concerned maternal expression, she arrived at the Caldwell mansion within hours of Henry and Lily's departure. Thomas, grateful for any distraction from his physical discomfort, welcomed Catherine's visit with pathetic eagerness. He looked terrible, pale, thin, and trembling slightly, even beneath heavy blankets. His eyes, normally bright with gentle intelligence, appeared dull and unfocused. "You poor dear," Catherine cooed, settling herself beside his bed with the practiced efficiency of a woman experienced in extracting information from vulnerable targets. Dr. Foster says it's just nerves, but you look positively ill. Have you been eating properly? Thomas admitted that his appetite had been poor for several weeks, that food seemed to taste strange, and that even his favorite dishes left him feeling nauseated. He attributed these symptoms to wedding anxiety and the pressure of increased business responsibilities. But Catherine's experienced eye detected signs that suggested something far more sinister. She had seen similar symptoms before, during the winter of 1887, when old Charles Morgan had slowly wasted away from what his family believed was a lingering fever, but what Catherine's suspicious nature had correctly identified as arsenic poisoning administered by his young wife. The gradual weight loss, the persistent stomach problems, the trembling hands and dulled reflexes, all pointed to systematic poisoning rather than simple nervousness. "Tell me about your meals," Catherine prompted gently. "Are you eating the same foods as your father and Miss O'Connor?" Thomas considered this question with the deliberate care of someone whose thinking had become slow and labored. "Well, Father often takes his meals at the hotel when he has business meetings. And Lily has been dining with clients quite frequently, learning about the business, you understand." Catherine understood perfectly. If her suspicions were correct, Henry and Lily had been carefully ensuring that Thomas consumed poisoned food while they remained safely unaffected. "Who prepares your food, dear?" Catherine asked. "Mrs. Thompson, our cook, usually, though Father sometimes brings me special tonics from Dr. Foster to help with my digestion. And Lily has been so thoughtful. She often brings me tea or broth when I'm feeling poorly." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Here was evidence of opportunity and method, delivered with the innocent trust of a victim who had no idea that his own family was slowly murdering him. But Catherine was too experienced in the art of scandal to reveal her suspicions prematurely. Instead, she spent the remainder of her visit gathering more information about the household routines, the timing of Thomas's symptoms, and the precise nature of his relationship with his father and fiancée. What she learned confirmed her worst fears. Thomas's illness had begun shortly after Lily's arrival in Savannah. The symptoms had grown progressively worse during the weeks when Henry and Lily were spending increasing amounts of time together. Most damning of all, Thomas's condition seemed to improve slightly whenever his father traveled on business, only to deteriorate again upon Henry's return. By the time Catherine left the Caldwell mansion, she possessed enough circumstantial evidence to destroy 3 lives with a single well-placed conversation. But she also understood that accusations of murder required more than suspicion, particularly when they involved Savannah's most powerful businessman and his son's Irish fiancée. Meanwhile, in Augusta, Henry and Lily were discovering that physical distance from their complicated situation only intensified their emotional connection. The train journey had provided hours of private conversation. The hotel accommodations had eliminated the need for careful chaperoning, and the business meetings had demonstrated their intellectual compatibility in ways that purely social interactions never could. "We work well together," Henry observed as they reviewed contract terms in his hotel suite after a successful day of negotiations. "You understand the financial implications of these deals better than Thomas ever has." Lily, emboldened by wine and the intoxicating sense of being valued for her intelligence rather than merely her potential as a wife and mother, found herself speaking more freely than she ever had before. "Thomas doesn't really want to understand," she said. "He performs his duties, but he has no passion for the work itself. He'd rather read poetry than build an empire." "And you? What would you rather do?" Lily met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether they continued their elaborate pretense or acknowledged the desires that had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather build an empire," she said quietly. Henry's response came not in words, but in actions that would bind them together in conspiracy and passion. When he kissed her, Lily felt every carefully constructed barrier between duty and desire crumble away. When she responded with equal intensity, they both understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. What followed was a night of physical intimacy that revealed the true depth of their emotional connection. But it was also a night of planning, of whispered conversations about futures that could only be achieved through the elimination of inconvenient obstacles. "Thomas's illness isn't improving," Henry said as they lay together in the pre-dawn darkness. "Dr. Foster is concerned that it might be something more serious than simple nervous exhaustion." Lily understood immediately what he was suggesting. "How serious?" "Potentially fatal if it continues to progress." They spoke in euphemisms and implications, never stating their intentions directly, but both understood perfectly what was being discussed. Thomas's death would solve their problems completely, freeing Lily from an unwanted marriage while providing Henry with both the woman he desired and a plausible explanation for their subsequent union. "Such things happen," Lily murmured. "Young men with weak constitutions sometimes succumb to illnesses that stronger people survive." "Exactly. And a grieving father might naturally offer protection to his son's bereaved fiancée." But their careful planning faced an unexpected complication when they returned to Savannah the next evening. Catherine Ramsey was waiting for them at the railroad station, her presence clearly not coincidental. "Mr. Caldwell," she called out as they disembarked from the Augusta train. "I do hope your business went well. Poor Thomas has been quite worried about your absence." Catherine's tone was perfectly polite, but her eyes conveyed a message that made both Henry and Lily understand that their secret was no longer entirely secret. Here was a woman who suspected something, who had been watching and waiting and drawing conclusions that could prove extremely dangerous. "Mrs. Ramsey," Henry replied with careful courtesy, "how thoughtful of you to inquire about our trip. I trust Thomas's condition hasn't worsened in our absence." "Oh, quite the contrary. He seemed much improved this afternoon, almost as if the change in his routine had been beneficial." The implication was clear. Catherine had not only observed Thomas's illness, but had noticed its relationship to his father's presence. She was sending a warning that she understood exactly what was happening and would be watching for any further developments. As they rode home through the dark streets of Savannah, Henry and Lily understood that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Catherine Ramsey's suspicions meant that any further deterioration in Thomas's health would be scrutinized with uncomfortable intensity. They needed to act quickly, decisively, and in a way that would deflect suspicion rather than attract it. The solution, when it came to them, was brilliantly simple and utterly ruthless. The morning of October 24th, 1890, brought crisp autumn weather, perfect for what would become the final hunt of Thomas Caldwell's life. Henry announced at breakfast that he had arranged a farewell hunting expedition for his son and several close friends, a traditional bachelor party to celebrate Thomas's last day as an unmarried man. Thomas, who had seemed somewhat improved since his father's return from Augusta, greeted this proposal with genuine enthusiasm. He had always enjoyed hunting, despite his generally gentle nature, and the prospect of spending time outdoors with friends appealed to him far more than the elaborate bachelor dinner his father had originally planned. "Excellent idea," Thomas said, his color better than it had been in weeks. "I could use some fresh air and exercise before tomorrow's ceremony." Lily expressed appropriate disappointment at being excluded from the masculine festivities, but privately she understood that this hunting trip represented the culmination of everything she and Henry had been planning. They had discussed the general outlines during their time in Augusta, but now she watched Henry implement the specific details with an efficiency that both impressed and terrified her. The hunting party would include 6 men: Thomas Henry, Edward Ramsey, Catherine's husband, Patrick Doyle from the hotel, Dr. William Foster, and Robert Murray, the mill's chief supervisor. All were experienced hunters, familiar with the wooded flats east of Savannah, and all possessed sufficient social standing that their testimony about any unfortunate accidents would be accepted without question. But Lily noticed details that the other participants missed entirely. Henry selected the hunting location, a remote section of timberland where fallen logs and dense underbrush would make movement difficult and visibility limited. He insisted on bringing specific rifles, claiming that certain weapons were better suited to deer hunting in heavy cover. He even suggested the hunting formation, positioning himself and Thomas in a way that would create opportunity for what he euphemistically called hunting mishaps. "Will you be all right alone for the day?" Thomas asked Lily as the hunting party prepared to depart. "I know it's not ideal," leaving you by yourself the day before our wedding." Lily assured him that she would use the time productively, perhaps visiting with some of the other ladies to discuss final wedding preparations. What she didn't mention was that she had already arranged to spend the afternoon with Catherine Ramsay, not from any desire for the woman's company, but because she understood the importance of establishing an alibi that would place her far from the scene of the planned accident. The hunting party departed at dawn, their rifles and ammunition loaded into a wagon that would carry them to the remote timber tract where Henry claimed to have seen signs of a large buck during his recent business travels. The men were in high spirits, joking about Thomas's nervousness and placing friendly wagers on who would bring down the finest deer. Dr. Foster had brought a flask of excellent whiskey to celebrate any successful kills, while Edward Ramsay contributed cigars imported from Cuba for the same purpose. Robert Murray, the most experienced hunter in the group, offered advice about tracking techniques and wind direction that would maximize their chances of success. Only Henry remained focused on practical, rather than social considerations, quietly noting terrain features, checking sight lines, and positioning the hunters in ways that would serve his purposes rather than theirs. The timber tract stretched across several hundred acres of rolling flats covered with oak, cypress, and pine trees. Fallen logs and thick underbrush created a landscape where hunters could easily become separated from their companions, where the sound of gunshots would echo confusingly among the trees, and where a man might lie wounded for hours before being discovered. Henry suggested that they spread out in a loose line, maintaining visual contact when possible, but allowing each hunter freedom to pursue promising tracks. This formation would enable them to cover more ground while reducing the likelihood of accidental shootings, a precaution that everyone applauded as evidence of Henry's thoughtful leadership. What the other hunters didn't realize was that this formation also created multiple opportunities for isolated encounters between father and son. Moments when a single gunshot might be attributed to anyone in the party, and when the absence of witnesses would allow for creative explanations of tragic accidents. The morning passed quietly, with occasional distant shots indicating that various hunters were engaging targets, but no calls of success to suggest that anyone had made a clean kill. Around midday, the party regrouped for lunch at a clearing beside a small creek, sharing sandwiches and coffee while comparing notes about deer sign and promising locations. Thomas seemed completely restored to health, his earlier symptoms apparently forgotten in the excitement of the hunt. He joked with the other men about his impending marriage, accepted their teasing about losing his freedom with good humor, and demonstrated the kind of relaxed confidence that had been missing from his personality for weeks. "You look like a new man," Dr. Foster observed approvingly. "Nothing like fresh air and exercise to cure nervous exhaustion." Henry agreed with apparent satisfaction, though Lily would have recognized the irony in his tone. Thomas did indeed look like a new man, which made what was about to happen seem all the more tragic and unnecessary. After lunch, the hunters separated again, this time moving toward a section of the tract where Murray claimed to have seen fresh deer tracks. The terrain here was particularly challenging, with steep slopes and thick cover that would require careful movement to avoid falls or becoming lost. Henry maneuvered himself into position approximately 60 yards behind Thomas, close enough for an accurate shot, but far enough away to claim that he had been targeting a deer that appeared to move behind his son's position. The other hunters were spread across a wide area, their attention focused on their own tracking rather than on their companions' activities. At approximately 3:00 in the afternoon, a single rifle shot echoed through the Georgia flats. When the other hunters converged on the sound, they found Henry kneeling beside Thomas's motionless body, his hands covered with blood from futile attempts to stop the massive chest wound that had clearly proven instantly fatal. "I thought I saw a deer moving through the brush," Henry gasped, his distress apparently genuine. "I took the shot before I saw that Thomas was directly in the line of fire. Oh God, what have I done?" The physical evidence supported his account perfectly. Thomas had been shot from behind with a heavy rifle at close range, the kind of wound that might result from a hunting accident in heavy cover. His position suggested that he had been moving away from his father's location, possibly pursuing deer tracks that had led him into the path of Henry's intended shot. Dr. Foster confirmed that death had been instantaneous, that no medical intervention could have saved Thomas even if help had arrived immediately. The other hunters, shocked by the tragedy but familiar with hunting accidents, accepted Henry's explanation without question. Such things happened, particularly when hunters pursued game in difficult terrain where visibility was limited. Robert Murray, whose experience made him the group's acknowledged expert on hunting safety, examined the scene carefully and pronounced it a textbook example of the kind of accident that occurred when hunters failed to maintain proper awareness of their companions' locations. "No one's to blame," he declared solemnly. "These flats are treacherous, and deer can lead a man into dangerous positions before he realizes his mistake." But as they prepared Thomas's body for transport back to Savannah, Edward Ramsey noticed something that troubled him deeply. The angle of the wound suggested that the shot had been fired from a position slightly above and behind Thomas's location, exactly where Henry claimed to have been standing, but the powder burns on Thomas's clothing indicated that the rifle had been discharged from much closer range than 60 yards. Edward said nothing at the time, understanding that such observations would only add to Henry's grief and guilt. But as they carried Thomas's body down from the flats, he found himself wondering whether the hunting accident had been quite as accidental as it appeared. Meanwhile, in Savannah, Lily O'Connor was maintaining her carefully planned alibi by spending the afternoon in Catherine Ramsey's parlor, discussing wedding flowers and reception menus with apparent enthusiasm. When news of the hunting accident arrived via breathless messenger, Lily's response was perfectly calibrated: shock, grief, and desperate concern for Henry's emotional state. "Oh, the poor man," she sobbed convincingly. "To lose his son in such a horrible way, and just hours before Thomas's wedding. How will he ever forgive himself?" Catherine Ramsey, however, was watching Lily's performance with the calculating gaze of a woman who had spent years studying human nature. While Lily's words expressed appropriate emotions, her eyes revealed something else entirely. A satisfaction that she was struggling to conceal behind tears that seemed somehow forced. As evening fell, and the hunting party returned to Savannah with Thomas's body, Catherine understood that she was witnessing the culmination of the most carefully planned murder in Chatham County's history. But she also understood that proving such a crime would require evidence that no longer existed. Witnesses who had already accepted the official version of events, and a community that would prefer to believe in tragic accidents rather than face the horror of premeditated murder. The funeral of Thomas Caldwell on October 26, 1890, drew the largest crowd in Savannah's history. Hundreds of mourners filled the Presbyterian church and spilled onto the surrounding streets, united in grief for a young man whose life had been cut short by what everyone accepted as a terrible hunting accident. Henry, devastated by guilt and loss, could barely speak during the service. His obvious anguish convinced even skeptical observers that whatever mistakes he might have made in the woods, they had been the result of tragic miscalculation rather than deliberate intent. When he collapsed during the graveside ceremony and had to be supported by friends, the last doubts about his innocence seemed to vanish. Lily O'Connor, dressed in mourning black and maintaining a dignified composure despite her obvious grief, received condolences as both the deceased's fiancé and his father's future responsibility. Several well-meaning ladies suggested that she might want to return to Philadelphia, that remaining in Savannah would only prolong her sorrow, but Lily quietly indicated her intention to stay and help Henry through his darkest hour. "I couldn't abandon him now," she told Father Kelly when he offered to arrange her transportation back to Pennsylvania. "Thomas would have wanted me to care for his father." The priest, troubled by aspects of the situation he couldn't quite articulate, accepted this explanation while making mental notes to observe the household dynamics more carefully in the coming weeks. Catherine Ramsey, watching these interactions with a cynicism born of experience, understood exactly what she was witnessing. Lily O'Connor had no intention of leaving Savannah because Savannah represented everything she had ever wanted: wealth, social position, and partnership with a man powerful enough to reshape circumstances according to his desires. But Catherine also understood that accusation without proof would accomplish nothing except her own social destruction. Henry Caldwell commanded too much respect and wielded too much influence for anyone to challenge his version of events without overwhelming evidence. And that evidence, if it had ever existed, was now buried along with Thomas in the Savannah cemetery. So Catherine chose a different strategy. Instead of confronting the conspirators directly, she began a patient campaign of observation and documentation, recording every interaction between Henry and Lily, noting the timing of their eventual engagement, and gathering testimony from servants and employees who might have observed suspicious behavior during the weeks preceding Thomas's death. Her instincts proved correct. By Christmas of 1890, Henry and Lily were seen together frequently, their shared grief apparently creating a bond that transcended normal proprietary concerns. By Easter of 1891, rumors of an engagement were circulating throughout Savannah society. And in July of 1891, exactly 9 months after Thomas's death, Henry Caldwell married Lily O'Connor in a quiet ceremony that acknowledged their mutual loss, while celebrating their hope for future happiness. The marriage seemed to restore Henry's spirits and provide Lily with the social position she had always craved. They worked together efficiently in managing the expanded lumber operations, traveled frequently to discuss business opportunities in other cities, and presented themselves as a couple united by tragedy, but determined to build something meaningful from their shared experience of loss. But Catherine Ramsay's careful observations revealed details that others missed. The newlyweds displayed none of the tentative affection typical of couples brought together by circumstances. Instead, they interacted with the easy intimacy of people who had been lovers long before their marriage became socially acceptable. Their conversations revealed shared references and private jokes that seemed to predate Thomas's death by weeks or months. More significantly, Lily seemed to possess detailed knowledge of business operations that she could only have acquired through extended private instruction. She participated in contract negotiations with the confidence of someone who understood every aspect of the lumber trade, made strategic recommendations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of market conditions, and handled financial calculations with mathematical precision that suggested considerable experience with the company's books. When Catherine shared these observations with her husband, Edward confirmed that Lily's business acumen had indeed seemed remarkably advanced for someone who had supposedly learned about lumber operations only after her fiancé's death. Her questions during board meetings revealed understanding of concepts that typically required years of experience to master. It's as if she had been studying the business for months before Thomas died, Edward observed uneasily, almost as if she had been preparing to take over his role in the company. Catherine nodded grimly. Here was evidence that the conspiracy between Henry and Lily had been planned far in advance, that Thomas's murder had been part of a larger strategy to eliminate an inconvenient obstacle to their personal and professional partnership. But evidence of planning, while morally damning, fell short of legal proof. Without witnesses to the actual crime, without physical evidence of premeditation, without testimony from the participants themselves, Catherine could do nothing except watch and wait for the conspirators to make mistakes that might expose their guilt. Those mistakes, when they came, proved more dramatic than Catherine had anticipated. In the summer of 1893, Robert Murray, the mill supervisor who had pronounced Thomas's death an accident, was found dead in his home under circumstances that initially appeared to be natural causes. Dr. Foster attributed the death to heart failure, noting that Murray had been complaining of chest pains for several weeks before his collapse. But Murray's widow, Sarah, revealed to Catherine that her husband had been deeply troubled by something related to the Caldwell family in the weeks before his death. He had mentioned receiving visits from Henry that seemed to upset him considerably, had talked about things that didn't add up regarding Thomas's hunting accident, and had even suggested that they might need to leave Savannah if certain suspicions proved correct. He was frightened, Sarah confided to Catherine during a private conversation after the funeral. Not of physical danger, but of something that could destroy our family's reputation and livelihood. Catherine understood immediately what Murray had discovered and why his death had become necessary. As the hunting party's most experienced member, Murray possessed the technical knowledge to recognize inconsistencies in the official version of Thomas's death. If he had begun asking questions or demanding explanations, he could have unraveled the entire conspiracy. 6 months later, Dr. William Foster suffered what appeared to be a riding accident while making house calls in the rural areas outside Savannah. His horse, normally reliable and gentle, had reportedly been spooked by a snake and thrown the doctor against a tree with sufficient force to break his neck. But the timing of Foster's death, coming so soon after Murray's, struck Catherine as suspiciously convenient. As the physician who had examined Thomas's body and pronounced the death accidental, Foster possessed medical knowledge that could potentially contradict the official findings if he ever chose to reconsider his initial conclusions. Catherine began to understand that she was witnessing not a single murder, but a systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to Henry and Lily's secret. The two deaths following Thomas's had been carefully disguised as natural causes and accidents, but they followed a pattern that could hardly be coincidental. When Edward Ramsey began expressing his own concerns about the unusual number of deaths among people connected to the Caldwell family, Catherine realized that her husband might be positioning himself to become the next victim of the conspiracy he was attempting to expose. Her fears proved prophetic. In April of 1894, Edward suffered what appeared to be a severe case of food poisoning after attending a business dinner hosted by Henry and Lily. The symptoms initially seemed mild: stomach upset and fatigue that Dr. Foster's replacement attributed to spoiled oysters served at the hotel restaurant. But Edward's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days, despite medical treatment that should have been effective for simple food poisoning. Catherine, remembering Thomas's similar symptoms before his death, understood that she was watching her husband die from the same systematic poisoning that had weakened Henry's son. This time, however, Catherine was prepared. She had spent 4 years gathering evidence, documenting suspicious deaths, and building relationships with law enforcement officials outside Chatham County who might be willing to investigate crimes that local authorities preferred to ignore. When Edward died on April 20, 1894, Catherine Ramsey was ready to reveal everything she knew about the conspiracy that had claimed at least 4 lives and threatened to claim many more. But as she sat in the telegraph office preparing to send messages that would bring federal marshals to Savannah, Catherine realized that even her carefully gathered evidence might not be sufficient to convict 2 people who had demonstrated remarkable skill at eliminating witnesses and covering their tracks. The story of Henry Caldwell and Lily O'Connor had already become part of Savannah folklore, a tragic tale of love emerging from loss, of 2 people finding comfort in shared grief and building something beautiful from the ashes of their mutual tragedy. The community had invested too much emotional energy in this romantic narrative to accept the possibility that it had been built on carefully planned murders and systematic deception. Catherine's telegrams went unanswered. The federal marshals found more pressing concerns elsewhere, and the deaths that had troubled her so deeply were officially forgotten, filed away in the courthouse basement along with other unpleasant memories that Savannah preferred not to examine too closely. Henry and Lily Caldwell continued to prosper, expanding their lumber empire across 4 states and establishing themselves as one of Georgia's most influential families. They had 3 children together, built a magnificent mansion that dominated Savannah's skyline, and were remembered by subsequent generations as pioneers who had helped transform the Georgia coast into a thriving center of American commerce. Catherine Ramsey died in 1896, taking her suspicions to a grave located less than 50 yards from Thomas Caldwell's final resting place. Her detailed journals, discovered decades later during renovation of the family home, provided the evidence that law enforcement had refused to pursue during her lifetime. But by then, Henry and Lily were long dead themselves, their crimes buried beneath layers of community pride and historical romanticism that made objective investigation impossible. The truth about what really happened in those Georgia flats remained hidden until 1989, when construction workers renovating the basement of the Chatham County Courthouse discovered a collection of documents that Catherine Ramsey had hidden behind a false wall. Her meticulous records, combined with recently discovered letters between Henry and Lily, finally revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed at least 5 lives and corrupted an entire community's understanding of justice. Reading Catherine's journals today, it's impossible not to admire her persistence in pursuing truth despite overwhelming odds. But it's equally impossible to ignore the chilling efficiency with which Henry and Lily eliminated every threat to their secret, transforming what should have been a simple murder investigation into a decades-long campaign of systematic elimination. The most disturbing aspect of their story may be how completely they succeeded in rewriting history according to their desires. For over a century, the people of Savannah remembered them not as criminals, but as romantic figures who had found love in the aftermath of tragedy. What a haunting tale of deception and ambition, hidden in the heart of 1890s Georgia. Do you think Catherine Ramsey uncovered the full truth? Or could there be even darker secrets buried in those coastal flats? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what state you're watching from. If this chilling story gripped you, give us a like, hit that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell for more forgotten mysteries from America's past. Share this video with a friend who loves a good historical scandal, and we'll see you in the next one, where we'll dig into another dark tale that time tried to bury.